The summer nights in Harlem moved like honey, slow and thick with heat. I remember the way the old neighborhood used to hum beneath the street lamps, the hum of soft jazz from windows left open, the sound of tired voices drifting over the sidewalks, the quiet clinking of glasses behind the closed doors of backroom joints. I was born Anthony Salerno, but long before the world would know me as Fat Tony, I was just another Italian boy on East 115th Street, trying to make sense of a world that never moved too fast. Our apartment was small, but Ma kept it spotless, the kind of clean that smelled like vinegar and boiling linens. Pop was quiet most days, worked with his hands. Brick by brick, wall by wall, he laid foundations across this city, while I watched the cracks form in our own. They say you can feel the pull of power even before you understand it, and I suppose that's what happened to me. I could see it in the way certain men walked, in how they never had to raise their voice, but always got what they wanted. I was 10 when I first saw old man Moretti come into Vinny's bakery with two shadows behind him, men who said nothing, men who smiled only with their eyes. I watched as Vinny handed over an envelope without looking up, his hands shaking just slightly. That moment stuck with me, not the fear, but the control. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, it was calm, measured, like a slow-moving river with hidden depths. Harlem in the 20s wasn't kind, but it taught you lessons fast. I learned to keep my mouth shut, my ears open, and my shoes clean. I ran errands for coins, delivered packages with no questions asked, and always returned with my shoes polished. They noticed. The older boys, the ones who wore fedoras with purpose and never hurried. They'd toss me a nickel, a nod, sometimes a cold soda on a hot day. I was small, but I listened. I remembered everything, peep. Think the life starts with a gunshot, a deal, or a body in the river. But it doesn't. It starts with silence, a quiet pull, a glance exchanged in the back room, a whisper over wine. By the time you hear the noise, you're already deep in it. Years passed like pages in a forgotten book. I stayed quiet. I grew, in size and in reputation. They called me Fat Tony by the time I was 17. Not out of disrespect, but out of familiarity. Like calling a lion Kitty, there was weight in the name, and in this life, weight means presence. I didn't rush. That was never my way. I watched the old-timers, the way they spoke, the way they moved. They never blinked when they lied, never laughed when they robbed. There was an elegance in their ruthlessness, a calm precision, the kind of men who ruled not by fear, but by inevitability. And as I lay in bed each night, listening to the low rumble of the city, I imagined myself among them, not just one of the boys, but someone they'd respect, someone they'd fear just a little, someone whose name moved like smoke through every borough. I wasn't in a hurry. No king ever rushed to his throne. The streets became my classroom, and my teachers never raised their voices. Everything was taught in gestures, in nods, in the way a man paused before answering a question. Harlem had its rhythm back then, and you had to learn to walk in step or get swallowed whole. I wasn't the strongest, nor the fastest, but I was always watching, always absorbing the unwritten code that governed our corners and alleyways. By 16, I knew which storefronts paid protection and which ones didn't. I knew which cabs to avoid after dark, and which back rooms were fronts for card games that went on for days. I was running numbers for a guy named Louis Pappalardo. Louis wasn't a made guy, but he was connected. He had a gold tooth and the kind of laugh that made old men uneasy. I'd sit in the corner of his candy shop after school, counting bills behind the licorice jars. He liked me because I never asked questions and never lost track of a dollar. One rainy afternoon, I delivered an envelope to a bar off 2nd Avenue. I knocked twice, then twice more, just like Louis told me. The door creaked open, and a tall man with a crooked nose looked me over like I was some stray dog. He took the envelope, opened it right there, and counted the bills. When he was done, he didn't thank me, just said, "Tell Louis this is short." Then he closed the door. I didn't run back. I walked, slow and steady, like I'd been doing this for years. When I handed Louis the message, he didn't flinch. He just stared at me, then lit a cigarette, the tip glowing like a coal in the dim light. "You didn't argue with him?" he asked. I shook my head. "Good," he said, blowing smoke toward the ceiling. "You ain't paid to talk. You're paid to listen." That was the day I understood the value of silence. In our world, talking could get you killed, but silence, that could get you respected, trusted, even feared. Over time, I got more envelopes, bigger ones, some with just cash, others with names. I never opened them, never even peeked. That kind of discipline made its way up the ladder. Men I didn't know began to nod at me when I passed. Some shook my hand. One even gave me a cigar and said, "You keep doing what you're doing, kid." They say reputation is everything, but what they don't tell you is it's built quietly. No announcements, no applause, just years of showing up, doing your job, and keeping your mouth shut. I remember one night, late summer, moon high in the sky, I was told to wait outside a pool hall on 108th. I sat on the steps, watching shadows shift behind the windows. After an hour, the door opened and two men walked out. One of them was Salvatore Gigante, a capo, a man whose name you didn't say unless you had a reason. He looked at me, nodded once and said, "You're Louis's kid?" I nodded. "You're quiet," he said. "That's good. We need more quiet." He walked off into the dark, but I never forgot that moment. Being noticed by someone like him, it meant the machine was watching, and the machine never watched without purpose. My rise didn't come fast. It came like everything else in my life. Slow, steady, inevitable. I wasn't chasing power. I was building something older, deeper, trust. And once you have that, the rest finds its way to your doorstep. The first time someone called me Fat Tony in public, I didn't even turn my head. It was at a social club off Pleasant Avenue, one of those places where the lights were always dim, the cigars never went out, and everyone had somewhere to be, yet stayed for hours. I was sitting at the edge of the room, sipping a dark espresso, when a man I didn't know leaned over to another and whispered, "That's Fat Tony, Louis's kid." It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. That name, Fat Tony, had begun to float through certain circles, not in mockery, not in jest, but in recognition. It wasn't about weight, it was about presence. I filled a room with silence, and silence, in our world, was a kind of gravity. I spoke when I needed to, but I listened far more. That quietness, it unnerved people, and I learned early that when a man doesn't speak much, everything he does say carries more weight. By then, Louis had introduced me to bigger men, guys with nicknames like Beansy and Shorty, men who wore wool in the summer and never counted cash in front of outsiders. They liked me because I didn't try to impress them. I wasn't looking for a seat at their table. I was just trying to stay in the room long enough for them to forget I was young. I became known for getting things done. A package delivered here, a message relayed there, always exactly as it was given to me. No details added, no color. It was a trait the older guys respected. They began to trust me with more. I didn't boast. I didn't talk after drinks. I watched. I remembered. In those days, Harlem was changing. The streets were louder, the buildings taller. New faces moved in, but the old ways held steady in the shadows. The Genovese family was growing, threading its influence through numbers, games, loan sharking, construction bids. They were quiet operators, never flashy like the others. That appealed to me. Flash burned too, quickly. Quiet power. That was eternal. One afternoon, I was called to a meatpacking warehouse on the west side. I sat at a folding table with a man named Alphonse, one of the family's mid-level earners. He wore suspenders and kept his nails clean. He told me the outfit was watching me. He said they liked how I moved, said I had discipline, an old man's patience in a young man's body. "You ever think about coming in?" he asked me. I knew what he meant. Not just being around, not just being useful. He meant the life, really in it. I didn't answer right away. I just looked him in the eye, nodded once. I didn't need to say anything more. "You keep moving like you are," he said. "They'll make room for you." After that, things moved quietly. Men who had barely noticed me before started offering me seats at their tables. I got new suits, darker, tailored. I stopped running packages and started managing the runners. I learned the books, not just who owed what, but who was always late, who talked too much, who had a weakness for cards. Knowledge was power, quiet power, the kind that never needed to raise a hand. The name Fat Tony began to move from back rooms into boardrooms, not in fear, but with caution, with respect. I wasn't a boss, not yet, but I was something else now, something solid, something permanent. The foundation had been poured, the walls were rising, brick by careful brick. I never rushed the climb. That's what separated me from the ones who came and went like wind across rooftops. Some guys, they wanted the spotlight. They talked too much, dressed too loud, made promises their hands couldn't back up. But not me. I built my name like a cathedral, slow, stone by stone, never forgetting that one bad crack brings the whole thing down. By the early 40s, I was in the Bronx more than Harlem. That's where the money was breathing heavier, shifting through dice games, Shylocks, union hands waiting for their weekly taste. The Genovese family had fingers in everything that moved without making noise. That's how they operated, and that's how I liked it. Controlled, deliberate, invisible. You didn't see us in the papers, you heard our names behind closed doors. I ran a social club near Arthur Avenue, behind a fruit stand owned by a man named Pietro. The front was humble, wooden counters, crates of oranges stacked up to the ceiling. But behind the heavy curtain, we had a phone line that never rang unless it had to, a chalkboard with names and debts, and a poker table that never folded. That little back room became my church. Men came in restless, left calm. That was the effect I had. My presence settled things. I never threatened. I didn't need to. My boys, Joey, Nicky and Sal, they watched the doors, poured the wine, kept their tempers cold. And me? I just sat, smoked the same cigar, wore the same jacket, and let my stillness do the talking. It wasn't about muscle, it was about certainty. When I looked a man in the eye, he knew I'd remember what he said, and if he lied, it would follow him. We weren't killing guys. That was for stories, for the fools who thought blood made them men. Real power came from knowing a man's weaknesses, using them like levers, and never raising your voice. I lent money, but only to those who could sleep at night knowing they owed me. I brokered peace between bookies, settled disputes between contractors, made sure the trucks ran on time and the cops got their envelopes before sunrise. In time, they started asking for me. Let's bring in Fat Tony, they'd say. Not because I was violent, but because I was fair, unshakable. There's a quiet dignity in being the man they call when everything's on the line. That reputation rose up like smoke, slow, curling through the boroughs. I wasn't made yet, but I was trusted. And in our world, trust is the only currency that doesn't lose value. One day, an older capo named Vito Romano came into my club. I hadn't spoken to him more than once or twice. He sat across from me, folded his hands and said, "You remind me of Costello." I didn't respond, just gave a slow nod. Frank Costello was legend, the Prime Minister of the underworld. He didn't need to pull a trigger. He ran New York from a chair behind a desk. That's what I wanted. Not just to survive, but to shape the world from behind the curtain, quietly, permanently. The bosses were watching, and when the time was right, they'd make their move. But I wasn't in a hurry. I never was. The first real sit-down I was invited to didn't come with fanfare. There was no gold chain handed to me, no grand speech. It was a Tuesday, grey and drizzling, the kind of day that washed the city clean for an hour before the grime came back. Joey told me to wear a dark suit, no pinstripes, no flash, just clean, respectful. I knew what that meant. The men I'd be facing didn't care for noise. The meeting took place in the back of a florist's shop on Mulberry Street. You had to walk past the lilies and the orchids, past a short woman who didn't smile, through a hallway that smelled like cold soil and coffee grounds. The back room was lit by a single bulb that swung slightly in the breeze from the cracked window. No one smoked in there. That was a sign of respect. The men didn't need to fill the air with anything but their presence. 3 of them sat already, capos from the Bronx, Brooklyn and Jersey. Men who'd each buried more years in this life than I'd lived. I recognized them all. You don't forget faces like theirs. At the head of the table sat a man they called Big Sal, a consigliere with eyes like dull coins. He didn't introduce himself. He just nodded when I sat. The first 10 minutes were silence, except for the clink of glasses being set down and the slow scrape of a chair leg. Then Big Sal spoke, calm, like he was reciting a prayer. "You've been making waves," he said. "Not the kind we don't like. The other kind. The kind we remember." I said nothing, just listened. "You've kept the streets quiet, handled debts without blood, built something steady, not sloppy." He leaned back. "That's rare." There was a pause. I didn't fill it. Then he asked, "You know what it means to be called in like this?" I nodded. "I'm being measured." A thin smile crossed his lips. Not warm, but not cold either. Good, he said. Because what comes next, if it comes, you don't, well, Ulk away from, not in this life, not in the next. I knew what he meant. The life, being made, it wasn't a promotion, it was a burial of everything outside the family. Once you're in forever. I told him I understood. He leaned forward and said, "You'll hear from us soon." That was it. No ceremony, no champagne. I stood, nodded to each man, and walked out. Back through the flowers, past the woman who still didn't smile, and out into the grey rain. I didn't feel fear. I felt something else, a kind of quiet gravity. The life had been circling me for years. Now it was folding in. That night, I didn't go to the club. I went home, sat in the kitchen with a glass of red wine, and listened to the ticking of the wall clock. I thought about Ma, about Pop and his quiet hands, about all the streets I'd walked, all the envelopes I'd delivered, all the names I never said aloud. The next chapter wasn't mine to rush. In this life, timing is everything. And mine was coming. It happened on a cold December night. No date was given in advance. Just a word, tonight. That's how they do it. Quietly. Always quiet. You don't ask questions. You don't tell your mother. You don't tell your girl. You leave your home the same way you always do, with your shoes polished and your coat buttoned like you're going to dinner or a wake. And in a way, you are. They drove me out to a house in Yonkers, nothing fancy. 2 stories, white shutters, a garage with a rusted Buick out front. From the outside, it looked like a retired plumber lived there. Inside, the blinds were drawn, and the room smelled like linseed oil and cigars. The lights were dim, the furniture simple. In the basement, 5 men waited. One of them was Big Sal, another was Vito Romano. The rest I'd seen at tables, in back rooms, in courtrooms, but never all in one place. No words were wasted. They had me stand in front of a table with a candle, a knife, a saint's card, and a needle. I'd heard stories of what happens, but stories are louder than truth. The truth was calm, deliberate. They pricked my finger, held it over the saint's image, lit the card, let the flame burn close. "May your soul burn like this card if you betray us," Sal said. Then came the oath. I swore to uphold the code. Omerta, silence. Loyalty. I swore to protect the family, even above blood, even above God. I swore that death was preferable to betrayal. I said it slowly, each word like a stone placed into the foundation of something permanent. When it was done, they each kissed my cheek and said the words I'd waited a lifetime to hear. "You're one of us now." No applause, no gifts, just the solemn weight of belonging. When they say the ceremony makes you reborn, it's true. The man who walked into that house, he stayed behind. The man who left that night, buttoning his coat under the stars, that was Fat Tony, not Louis.'s kid, not the runner or the number boy, not the silent kid from the candy shop. I was now a made man in the Genovese family, and that meant something in every borough, every precinct, every courtroom. It meant I had a seat at the table, not just as a guest, but as part of the structure, a stone in the wall that wouldn't move. Driving home that night, the streets looked different, the same corners, the same lights, but I was no longer beneath them, I was behind them. When I got in, I hung my coat, poured a quiet drink, and sat by the window. Snow had started to fall, soft, gentle, like everything I'd worked for was folding around me like a blanket. Being made doesn't make you a boss, but it puts you on the road, and now the road was mine. Being made didn't mean you sat back and smoked cigars while the world moved around you. If anything, it meant the opposite. The ceremony wasn't a reward, it was a responsibility. Now every move I made didn't just reflect on me, it reflected on the family. The Genovese name was sewn into my skin, and any crack in my character would be a crack in theirs. I was told early on, "You earned your bones, now earn your keep." That meant work, real work. I was given territory, small at first, a few corners in the Bronx, numbers, loans, union jobs where the envelopes moved quietly between hands calloused from honest labor. I didn't change how I operated. I stayed quiet. I let my guys talk while I listened. If someone got loud, I got calmer, and it always worked. My book was kept clean. Every dollar in place, every name double-checked. The bosses liked that. I didn't skim. I didn't squeeze too hard. I let things breathe, let the neighborhood feel like it could live under me instead of beneath me. Within a year, my corner grew, then 2, then 5. I started placing my own guys, men who came up the way I did, careful, loyal, not greedy, men who knew how to wait their turn, men who understood the long game. We set up a little office above a tailor shop, just off Tremont. No signs, no names on the door, just a buzzer, and the understanding that if you were invited, you didn't bring anyone else. There, we ran loans, sorted labor contracts, and watched the books. We weren't flashy. We didn't throw parties or wear pinky rings the size of marbles. We stayed beneath the wind. Once a week, I'd meet with a captain named Angelo Marino, sharp dresser, older than me by 15 years, and already a made legend in the family. He watched me like a hawk, always with that half smile of his. One night, after I'd laid out the numbers and the projections, he leaned back and said, "You know what I love? Ike about you, Tony? You're boring." I raised an eyebrow. "That's a compliment," he added. "The good ones, the ones who last, they're boring. They don't crash cars, don't chase skirts, don't end up on the front page. They just keep earning, keep delivering, keep their mouths shut. You're going to go far." I didn't smile. I just nodded. The streets weren't getting any easier. New crews were pushing in. The Colombians had started whispering in corners. And the feds? They were always listening, but we weren't careless. We didn't talk on phones. We didn't say names. We built walls around every conversation, and inside those walls we planted things that would grow. The higher I rose, the quieter I became. Not out of fear, out of respect, for the life, for the weight of what I was carrying. You don't brag about the crown when it's made of stone. I wasn't aiming for the top. I was building something that couldn't fall. And the family? They were beginning to see it. Frank Costello wasn't alive anymore, but in our circles his name never left the room. They still called him the Prime Minister, because he ran the mob like a government, not a street crew. No guns, no chaos, just influence. He made senators lean his way with a smile and a folded note. He wore silk like it was armor. If Vito Genovese was muscle, Frank was mind. And somewhere along the line, people started saying I had that same stillness, that same patience. That kind of comparison didn't come easy. It didn't come loud either. It came in whispers, passed from man to man like a fine bottle. One day in the club, a low-level guy named Carmine told me, "You don't blink much when you talk." That's how Costello was. He said it like a compliment, and I took it like a warning. If you're being measured against ghosts, you better not trip over the living. But I understood what they meant. I didn't move fast. I didn't shout orders. I waited, weighed, and when I made a call, it stuck. I read people the way other men read newspapers. I knew when they were lying before they opened their mouths. That's why the bosses started sending me to settle disputes that others couldn't. I wasn't the biggest earner, not yet, but I was the safest bet. If there was trouble between two captains, territory overlap, numbers disputes, unions stepping out of line, they'd send me. They'd say, "Let Fat Tony handle it," and I did, always with calm, always with respect. There was a sit-down once between our guys and a crew out of Brooklyn. The matter was small, a construction contract, overlapping interests, but tempers were hot. These were men with reputations, and when pride gets involved, logic gets quiet. I sat at the center of the table, didn't say a word for the first 20 minutes. Let them talk, let them rant. When they finished, I asked one question. Who's losing money if we fight over this? The room fell still. I poured a drink, passed it down the table. Then I divided the contract right down the middle. 1 week here, 1 week there, expenses split. Nobody got everything, but nobody lost anything. That night, I got a call from Vito Romano. "You handled that like a judge," he said. "Not a gangster, that's rare." Those weren't words I repeated, but they stayed with me. In this life, you don't aim to be loud, you aim to be remembered. By now, I had 4 men under me. Joey ran collections, Sal handled the books, Nicky kept tabs on the streets, and Carlo watched everything. Phones, tails, rats. He was quiet even when drunk, the perfect ear in a world full of mouths. I never micromanaged. I let them work, but they all knew. If something smelled wrong, they told me. No secrets, no improvising. Frank Costello once said, "I don't run rackets, I run people." I took that to heart. I wasn't chasing power, I was shaping it. And in shaping it, I was becoming something more than just Fat Tony. The unions were always fertile ground, not just for money, but for reach. Control a union and you control the men who move the city. Bricklayers, truckers, dockhands. You touch everything from the moment it's unloaded from a ship to the day it's laid in concrete. You don't need guns for that. You need hands, paper, pressure, and someone who knows how to use all three without leaving fingerprints. I started with Local 560, quietly, just attending meetings, listening, letting the bosses know I was around. There was a shop steward named Angelo Russo, old school, skeptical of outsiders, thought every new face was a fed or a fool, but I showed up week after week, didn't push, didn't posture, just bought coffee, passed envelopes, nodded at the right times. One day when a vote came up about a job site out in Queens, Angelo leaned over and asked me, "What do you think?" That was the turning point. The moment the door cracked open, I told him straight. I think whoever controls the trucks controls the clock. Delay them, and you control the project. He gave me a long look, didn't nod, didn't smile, but the next week he started asking my advice before meetings. It was slow work. We weren't moving crates of cash. We were shifting schedules, rigging bids, funneling contracts through shell companies, one layer at a time. The money came in like rain, soft, steady, filling everything from pension funds to no-show jobs. My crew started wearing suits even on off days. Respect followed them into diners, barbershops, church steps. But with unions came eyes, political ones, federal ones. The feds had been sniffing around the Genovese family for years. Some crews made headlines with flashy hits or big heists. We made ours in silence, but silence doesn't hide everything. I told my guys, no phones, no names, keep everything analog. If you need to talk, talk in the car, parked by the hours. Ivor, where the wind swallows sound. I also kept distance, never signed anything, never showed up twice to the same meeting. I worked through intermediaries, men loyal enough to bleed but smart enough to think. We created layers so dense, a prosecutor would need a year just to find the edges. At night, I'd sit in the club and read the union reports, page after page of work stoppages, revised costs, site conditions. Boring to most, but to me it was like reading a symphony. Every number a note, every delay a rest. I could hear the money before it even arrived. The bosses noticed. One evening, I met with an underboss named Frank Bruno. He was heavy, sharp, the kind of guy who could talk to a mayor one minute and order a cleanup the next. He poured us each a drink and said, "You've turned concrete into gold." I shrugged. He smiled. "You're building something, Tony. Something that'll outlive us all." And maybe I was. I didn't want fireworks. I wanted foundations. Unions were just the beginning. I wasn't just collecting envelopes anymore. I was writing the playbook. By the time the 50s rolled in, the world outside our circles was changing. Politicians were smiling into cameras, televisions were whispering into living rooms, and the press had started learning how to ask the right kinds of questions. But inside our world, beneath the table, behind the curtain, nothing had changed. Not really. Men still owed, territory still shifted, envelopes still moved. But now, we had to be smarter, quieter. The bosses weren't interested in cowboys. They wanted thinkers, men who could sit in a restaurant with a senator and leave without a single fingerprint on the silverware. That's the game I had grown into, and I played it slow. I kept my crew small. Joey was now overseeing 24 loan accounts. Sal had expanded into bookkeeping for 3 construction firms, all legit on paper. Nicky handled labor disputes with just a handshake. And Carlo, always in the background, now had 2 ex-cops on his payroll, feeding us whispers before they hit a wiretap. We didn't show our faces unless we had to. I'd show up to weddings, baptisms, the occasional funeral, always respectful, always last to leave, always in a dark suit that didn't draw the eye. The old-timers used to say, "Make your money while they're looking the other way." And I made sure they always were. Sometimes I'd sit with other capos, heads bent low over plates of veal and pasta, pretending we were talking about cousins and business trips. But beneath the pleasantries, every fork was a signal, every glass raised a quiet agreement. You learn to talk without saying much. You learn to ask questions that aren't really questions. "How's your friend doing with that thing down in Brooklyn?" Might mean, "Is the warehouse still good for shipments?" And a nod in response, just one, small, barely there, meant the world kept turning. That's how we kept things alive. And even though my name wasn't at the top of the family tree, not yet, more and more men started bringing their problems to me first. Even guys outside the Genovese line, from Jersey, from Queens, from Staten Island. I became known for settling issues, quietly, permanently. Once, a bookmaker named Benny came to me shaking. He'd borrowed from two crews without realizing both worked under the same flag. Now the payments were colliding. He thought he was dead. I didn't threaten him, didn't shout. I made a few calls, rearranged a few hands. Within 2 days, his debt was consolidated, the terms revised, and the bosses on both ends were satisfied. Benny never forgot it. Neither did the men who watched how I handled it. You see, violence is noise, but clarity, that's a weapon, and I used it well. At the end of each day, I'd sit in the back of my club with a warm drink, listening to the ice melt in the glass, thinking about the silence that power demands. Most people think power shouts, but it doesn't. Real power whispers. And in that whisper I was learning how to become a boss. I wasn't a boss, not officially, not yet. But power isn't always handed with a title. It grows around you like ivy, slowly without ceremony, until one day you realize the room waits for you to speak before it breathes. It began subtly. A dispute over a numbers route in Manhattan. Two captains, old friends, couldn't agree on the territory split. Normally, a higher-up would have called them in, smoothed it over. Instead, they came to me. I listened. That was always step one. And when I gave them my answer, equal division, shared collectors, one central bookkeeper, they accepted it without protest. That wasn't about logic. That was about trust. The next week, a Shylock in Astoria went missing. His debt sheet was full of the wrong names. Police, city contractors, one judge's nephew. Panic whispered through the family. Everyone thought the feds had him. I found out he'd taken a bus to Philly, thinking he could disappear. My guys brought him back without bruises. I sat him down, offered him a drink, and told him the truth. You vanish again. I don't come looking. He paid what he owed, on time, with interest. After that, the calls started coming in pairs, then in threes, sit-downs, advice, endorsements. I wasn't stepping on toes. I was filling a space that had formed in the shadows. No flag, no crown, just presence. Even the bosses noticed. Vito Romano took me aside one evening and said, "You don't move fast, Tony, but the room moves with you." Still, I was careful. I didn't let ego speak. I wasn't looking to replace anyone. I understood something too many forget. The best seat at the table isn't always the one at the head. Sometimes it's the one everyone leans toward when the lights dim. My club on Arthur Avenue grew busier, but not louder. No drunks, no hangers-on. It wasn't the kind of place you wandered into. It was the kind you had to be invited to, and even then, you teared outside until someone nodded you in. We served espresso and silence. No phones, no dice. Just men talking in low tones with long memories. And above all, no violence under my roof. That was my rule. You settle your scores somewhere else. If you sit at my table, you keep your hands open and your temper folded. That rule alone kept us out of courtrooms. Men began to speak of me with a kind of reverence. Not fear, not awe, but certainty. Like gravity. Like I was the part of the world they didn't need to explain. I still lived modestly. No mansions, no flashy cars. I had a house in Westchester, clean and quiet, where I could sit on the porch at night and listen to the trees instead of the sirens. My mother was gone by then. Cancer took her quick. Pop had passed before I ever made my bones. But I think about them often, especially on those still nights. What they'd think if they saw the man I'd become. What they'd feel knowing I'd built something not just for me, but for everyone around me. I never wanted glory, just control. And now I had it, not in fire, but in stone. By the time the 60s rolled in, I had friends in every corner of the city, not friends in the way most people use the word. These weren't men I played cards with or called on Sundays. These were men who owed me favors they never forgot. Some wore overalls, some wore robes, some wore suits cut with enough precision to make a tailor weep. But all of them knew that when Fat Tony made a call, you picked up. Even if that call came through a courier with no name and no watch. It started with a precinct captain in the Bronx. He'd gotten in a jam over a gambling debt. Small time, but loud enough that internal affairs started sniffing around. I took care of it, cleared the books, paid off the right people, moved the attention elsewhere. He kept his badge. and I got a man in uniform who could make problems disappear before they ever made it to paper. Then there was a judge in Queens, a family man, liked horses too much. He owed a bookmaker in my circle more than he could whisper. I didn't threaten. I didn't need to. I made the debt go away, and in return, he made sure certain indictments landed in the right desk drawers, the ones that never opened. It wasn't about blackmail. That's amateur work. It was about building bridges, quiet ones. Bridges that didn't creak when you walked over them because they were made from favors, from moments of mercy, from silence that costs nothing at first but everything in the end. I called it the quiet network. No list, no chain of command, just a web that wrapped around the city so gently no one felt it tighten. Until one day, they realized the streets didn't move without my say-so. Even the clergy came calling, not for crime, for help. A parish on the edge of my territory was facing eviction. The landlord, a slick kid out of Brooklyn, was playing games with the paperwork. The priests came to me, not as a gangster, but as a neighbor. I made a call. That landlord sold the building for $1 and moved his ambitions elsewhere. The church never forgot, neither did the neighborhood. You see, true power isn't about making people fear you. It's about making people need you and knowing you'll be there when they call. I never said no to a man in need, as long as he understood the debt was permanent, not always paid in money, sometimes in silence, sometimes in loyalty, but always paid. Carlo kept track of it all, not on paper, never, just in his head. Every favor logged like a quiet drumbeat beneath the floorboards. And when I needed something, an introduction, a door opened, a signature delayed, it came faster than any envelope could travel. The bosses watched all this, the way I moved, the way I built something that no indictment could touch, because it didn't leave prints, just respect. One night, over dinner, Romano said to me, "You've done more with a nod than some men do with a gun." I took that as the highest compliment, because I wasn't building an empire you could see. I was building one you couldn't escape. The commission, people outside the life think of it like a myth, but it was real. A table shared between the 5 families, where the biggest moves were whispered and the rules of the underworld were enforced without courtroom or jury. No one joined it by asking. You were brought in when you were useful enough to be seen and silent enough to be trusted, and by the mid-60s my name had started showing up in those closed-door conversations. I was never a flashy earner. I wasn't running gambling halls that lit up the tabloids, and I didn't throw punches just to show I had muscle, but my numbers were steady. My crews didn't fight each other. My debt books were clean, and most important of all, I never brought heat. That's what the commission respected more than anything, control. Men like Carlo Gambino, Tommy Lucchese, and the Chin, they understood that a steady hand is harder to trace than a wild one. And by now, I'd proven I could hold a territory without a single broken window. It was Vito Romano who brought my name forward. There was a sit-down, neutral ground, a room above a seafood joint in Brooklyn. I wasn't invited, not yet. But afterward, I got a call. Romano's voice was even, quiet. "They're watching you now," he said. "Eyes from every family, and they like what they see." I didn't celebrate. I didn't pour a drink. I just took a slow walk through the neighborhood, past the stores, the bakeries, the garages where engines were louder than words. I could feel it in the air, how the name Fat Tony no longer stayed in the Bronx. It was whispered in Brooklyn, murmured in Staten Island, nodded at in Manhattan. The higher you go, the more you have to disappear. No boasting, no new cars. I drove the same Lincoln, wore the same dark overcoats, ate at the same restaurant on Tuesdays, always by the window, always with my back to the wall. It was around this time that the YO, Unger guys started asking for sit-downs, not over problems, over direction, over how to handle a partner skimming off the top, how to negotiate a turf overlap, how to deal with an FBI tail. And I gave them what they needed, not answers, but clarity. I showed them how to think, not just act. You teach by example in this life, not lectures, not threats, just presence, a calm that others begin to imitate. At night, I'd sit alone in my office above the tailor shop, just me, the quiet hum of the radiator, and the soft rustle of ledgers being closed. I'd think about where I started, running slips down back alleys for a man with a crooked grin, and where I was now. I wasn't a boss in title, but my voice moved things, and when the commission listens, they don't ask where your stripes are stitched. They listen because you've proven that when you speak, the street listens too. By the early 1970s, the world had shifted again. Streets I once ran with a pocket knife now buzzed with wiretaps and unmarked vans. Young gangsters were getting louder, flashier, messier. They wanted to be seen. I wanted to stay invisible. That difference, that instinct, was what set me apart. The Genovese family had always done things differently. Unlike the Gambinos or Colombos, we didn't put our bosses on the news. We didn't let the public know who was running things. The real power was always behind the curtain. So when the time came to put a face on the family, a front boss to draw the light away from the real one, my name came up. I wasn't surprised. It wasn't a promotion, not in the usual sense. It was a role, a shield, a decoy, but one that required respect, judgment, and absolute discipline. They needed someone who wouldn't crack, wouldn't talk, wouldn't draw attention for the wrong reasons, someone who could wear the title without needing the applause. I accepted. There was no ceremony, no handshake over candles, just a few words in a quiet room. "You're going to be the face now, Tony," they said, "but don't mistake that for the throne." And I didn't. I knew what I was walking into. The real boss, Chin Gigante, was still pulling the strings from the shadows, playing crazy to dodge indictments, mumbling in bathrobes through the streets of Greenwich Village. But behind that act, he was sharp, calculated, dangerous. We respected each other because we understood each other. Power lives in silence. As front boss, I took meetings, I handled messages, I absorbed the heat, and when the law came sniffing, they saw me, not Chin. That was the point. Most people wouldn't have lasted. The position came with exposure. Feds tracking your movements, newspapers whispering your name, prosecutors building quiet cases in dark offices. But I'd spent my life preparing for that. I left no paper, spoke in circles, gave nothing they could use, and everything they couldn't quite touch. In public, I was polite, smiling, approachable. In private, I made sure the books stayed clean, the rules enforced, and the peace kept. It was balance, and it required discipline. Once, a capo from Brooklyn got ambitious, tried to open a gambling house without clearing it. When I found out, I didn't yell, I didn't send hitters, I invited him to dinner. Over veal and red wine, I explained calmly how one move could destroy years of quiet. By dessert, he'd agreed to shut it down. I sent him home with leftovers. That's how you lead when the cameras are always pointed at you, not with fury, but with firmness. And always, always with quiet. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. People think power is noise. They think it's shouting orders, swinging weight, making scenes. But real power is the silence in the room after you've said just enough. That was the lesson I had carried from street corners to conference rooms, and now, sitting as front boss of the Genovese family, that lesson guided every breath. I didn't change much when I took the seat. I still ate at the same restaurant, still wore the same suits, still walked the same block every Sunday morning. But now, every move I made echoed in places I couldn't see. Boardrooms, courtrooms, precinct hallways. I could feel it, not like a spotlight, more like a shadow that stretched just ahead of me. When I entered a room, no one asked questions. They just waited to listen. Chin stayed behind the curtain, always playing the ghost. He'd mutter in corners of church basements, dressed like a man who didn't know where he was. But he knew. He always knew. He trusted me because I never asked for more. I never made a grab for the throne. That was what made us work. We both understood loyalty wasn't just about obedience. It was about restraint. And restraint was something the world was starting to forget. The younger guys coming up, they were brash. They didn't remember the old days, when a look said more than a gun. They wanted headlines, big scores, wild money. That kind of ambition gets you killed, or worse, noticed. I watched it happen from a distance. The other families got sloppy, wiretaps, flash bulbs, turncoats, but we stayed quiet. The Genovese family was like a fog, always present, never caught, and I made sure it stayed that way. Even our sit-downs became quieter, smaller, no big tables with shouting voices, just 2 or 3 trusted men leaning in over coffee, No notes, no names. If you couldn't remember what was said, you didn't belong at the table. Here was one night, I remember in particular, a dispute between crews. Money gone missing from a labor union job. Could have gotten ugly, could have led to blood. Instead, I called them both in, told them the deal, return the cash, split it down the middle, and no one loses a finger. They agreed, not because they feared me, but because they believed me. And belief, that's the rarest currency of all. You see, when you sit at the quiet table long enough, you learn what really runs this life. It's not threats, it's not guns, it's continuity, discipline, memory. We weren't just criminals, we were curators of a system older than any courtroom, a code written in loyalty and sealed in silence. That was my job, to preserve it, to protect it, and to make sure the next man earned his seat the hard way, by listening first and speaking last. There was always smoke. You couldn't sit in a chair like mine without it curling around your name. Rumors, suspicions, quiet investigations, they were part of the job, but I made sure there was never any fire. No phone calls caught, no meetings taped, no ledger left open. Everything passed, hand to hand, mouth to ear, behind doors that didn't squeak when they closed. Still, the feds were always watching. You could feel it in the air like a second shadow. Cars parked too long, strangers lingering near the corner payphone, agents trying to look like men out for lunch, wearing shoes too polished for the street. I never acknowledged them, never gave them a glance. That was the trick. If you act like they're not there, they start to wonder if they should be. Once in a while, they'd bring me in, subpoenas with long names and longer questions. I'd sit at the table, calm, polite. Anthony Salerno, I'd say. I'm retired. I run a real estate office now. I like horses. I play cards with friends. And they'd look at me like they wanted to tear off the mask, but there was nothing beneath it but more quiet. They called me the Howard Hughes of the mob, not because I hid, because I left no fingerprints. The newspapers loved to speculate. They printed stories with my name wrapped in quotation marks. Fat Tony, alleged mob boss, reputed kingpin. But all they ever had were words, no recordings, no witnesses, no confessions, just whispers behind frosted glass. And that's how I wanted it. The real bosses in this life, the ones who last, aren't the ones who shout. They're the ones who walk through smoke and never come out coughing. There was a time when one of my own got careless. Young guy, too loud, too eager. Started flashing cash, dropping names, drinking with strangers. Word got back to me that he'd been seen with a wire near a poker game in Yonkers. I didn't send anyone tow. Oh, hurt him. I didn't threaten. I just had Carlo pick him up and drive him home. Quiet ride, no conversation. But when he stepped out of the car, he found his bags packed on the sidewalk. Message delivered. The next day, he was gone. Moved to Nevada, took up work in a legitimate warehouse, never heard from again. That's how you put out fires before they start. Not with violence, but with finality. I spent my life building a wall between me and the flames. A wall made of men who understood what couldn't be said. A wall made of favors, respect, and time. So let them watch. Let them park their cars, scribble in their notebooks, scratch their heads. All they ever saw was smoke. Because I made sure the fire stayed deep underground, where it belonged. As the years moved quietly past, so did many of the faces I started with. Some died natural, others not so much. Some went away for long stretches and came back changed. Some never came back at all. The neighborhood changed too. The bakery closed down. The tailor who once hemmed my cuffs passed on. Even the air smelled different, less smoke, more steel. But I remained. Not because I pushed harder, but because I adapted. You don't survive this life by holding on to the old ways like a flag. You survive by knowing which rules still matter and which ones have become dangerous to keep. One by one, the old friends faded. Vito Romano passed quietly in his sleep, a man who had never once spoken out of turn. I sat alone at his funeral, under an umbrella, listening to rain tap gently on the stones. I didn't cry, but I remembered every favor, every warning, every silent nod exchanged across smoky tables. He had taught me much, and more by what he didn't say than what he did. And then there was Benny. Benny the cat, we used to call him. Slippery, sharp-eyed, always quick with a line. He ran numbers in Harlem and had a way with people. Benny had been with me from the start when we were both just kids chasing crumbs. In '78 he came to me with a problem, a new crew in Queens muscling into our Shylocks, taking liberties, testing patience. But things were different by then. We weren't the hungry kids anymore. We were elders in a business that no longer moved with respect. The young ones wanted to settle it fast, with fists or bullets. Benny wanted me to greenlight a message, a strong one. I told him no. Not this time, I said, stirring my espresso slowly. We don't need a body, we need a conversation. He didn't like it, said I was going soft, said I forgot who we were. But I hadn't forgotten, I had learned. One conversation, carefully placed, and the Queen's crew backed. D off. No blood, no paper trail, no graves. Benny never said it, but I knew he understood. We were old men by then. Our power wasn't in our fists, it was in the pauses between words, in our ability to avoid war while still winning it. That year, I started pulling back, not retiring, just stepping sideways, letting younger capos handle more of the day-to-day, watching who had the patience for silence, who didn't rush to speak. I watched as some rose quietly, and others burned out loud and quick. The streets change, the faces come and go, but the rules, the true ones, they stay. Loyalty, discipline, silence, and the understanding that sometimes the strongest move you can make is none at all. I bought the place in the late 70s, tucked away in the woods of Rhinebeck, a stone house built back in the 1930s. No neighbors for a mile, just trees and a narrow dirt road that wound like a ribbon from the highway to my front gate. It wasn't much by modern standards. 2 floors, a fireplace that smoked when the wind turned, and a porch that creaked under the weight of memory. But to me, it was peace. I didn't go there often, maybe once a month, sometimes alone, sometimes with an old friend or two, never for business. That house had no phones, no records, no visitors, only quiet, and the kind of silence that speaks louder than the city ever could. Out there, the air tasted like pine and ash. I'd sit out back in an old wicker chair, watching deer move slowly through the trees. In those moments, I wasn't Fat Tony. I wasn't the front boss of the most powerful family in America. I was just a man who'd lived long enough to value stillness more than sound. One evening in the fall, I sat with Benny and Carlo on the porch. We didn't speak much, just shared a bottle of red and let the wind move through the branches like a lullaby. Carlo asked me, after a long pause, if I ever thought it was all worth it. I remember my answer clearly. It was never about worth, I said. It was about understanding the rules and playing them better than anyone else. That's all any of this ever was. They nodded. No arguments. We all knew that you didn't get to our age by chasing some mythical idea of justice or meaning. We lived by code, not morals. Inside the house, I kept no pictures, no trophies, just books, most of them unread, and a heavy safe hidden behind a false wall. Not for money, but for notebooks, the old kind, handwritten, names, numbers, promises kept, and debts never collected. Not incriminating, just memory. The law never found that place, but I always knew they oaked. They tapped phones, they followed cars, they watched bank statements and listened through the walls of places they could get into. But the stone house in Rhinebeck remained untouched because it didn't exist in their version of my life. That was my gift, knowing what to show and what to keep hidden. And that house, it was mine alone. As the world around me grew louder, I grew quieter. The city buzzed with cases, informants, schemes. But in Rhinebeck, I could hear my own thoughts. I could remember faces long gone. I could sit in the stillness and know that, for all I'd done, I had preserved something they could never take away. Not a secret, not a dollar, but a silence deeper than sleep. We never saw it as a fall, not at first. The world shifted slowly, like the ground giving way under quiet feet. You don't notice it right away. You go on walking until the path you knew is gone, and all that's left is fog and footsteps you don't recognize. It started with the commission case, 1985. The headlines read like fiction. 7 bosses, RICO charges, life sentences looming. They called it the end of the Mafia, said the commission had been dismantled, like it was a business they'd shut down with 1 warrant and a few microphones. But that wasn't the truth. Not really. Truth was, we had already adjusted. They thought the commission ruled everything from one table. that we passed notes and orders like a board of directors. That might have been true once, but by the time the FBI drew that map, the game had already moved underground. Chin taught us that. Disappear behind layers, make noise somewhere else, then vanish into the quiet. But still, the indictments came. Concrete scams, labor rackets, union skimming. I saw names I knew, old friends, quiet captains, soldiers who once shared Sunday meals with my family. One by one they went away. Some folded, some didn't. And then, in '86, they came for me. They said I ran the Genovese family, said I was the front boss, giving orders with a nod and a glance. They had transcripts, wiretaps, informants whispering my name in cold courtrooms. I was indicted alongside the others. 5 counts: racketeering, extortion, conspiracy. The headlines painted me as the last one standing, but I didn't run, didn't protest, didn't beg. I walked into court wearing the same hat I always wore. Calm, heavy, certain. I remember the judge asking me questions, trying to piece together the life I never spoke aloud. But I said nothing that wasn't already public. I didn't complain. I didn't name names. They convicted me. Of me 100 years. And the world outside gasped, like they had won something. But I knew better. A prison sentence is just a new kind of quiet. A place where time slows and memory becomes the only thing they can't take. Behind bars, I had no turf, no envelopes, no meetings. But I still had the silence I'd mastered all my life. No complaints, no calls for sympathy. I accepted it the way I accepted everything else, with stillness. Let them think they saw the fall of the unseen. But I was never what they imagined, and they never understood what I truly built. Because it wasn't in names, it wasn't in money. It was in the silence between every word I never said. Prison doesn't roar, it hums, a low, constant rhythm of keys, shoes, doors, and voices trying not to carry. Men talk too much in places like that. They fill the silence because they're afraid of what they might hear in it. But not me. I welcomed it. Otisville wasn't cruel. It was quiet, surrounded by hills and trees. I had a cell with a narrow window that caught the sunrise just enough to remind you the world hadn't stopped spinning. Mornings began early. I'd sit with black coffee, lukewarm, and stare at the light stretching across the floor like a slow visitor. I didn't keep company, not unless I had to. I was polite, nodded, spoke when spoken to, but I stayed in my rhythm. That was the key. Keep your mind moving, your words few, your routine sacred. Inside, time becomes a trick, stretching and shrinking, depending on how you breathe through the hours. There were men who tried to get close, some looking for stories, others seeking protection in a name. They called me Mr. Salerno or Tony, depending on how long they'd been inside, but I never gave them much, just a smile, a shrug, maybe a line from an old Sinatra song if the air felt heavy. Books became my friends, history mostly, ancient Rome, old wars. I liked reading about empires that thought they'd last forever. Made me feel less alone, in a way. They fell too, not with fire, but with whispers, the same way our world did. They gave me a typewriter. I didn't write letters, I just typed names sometimes, not real ones, just shadows of people I once knew, men who never made the papers, soldiers who vanished before the stories were told. Typing their names made them real again, if only for a while. I thought often about that house in Rhinebeck, the creak of the floorboards, the cold touch of the stone walls. I wondered if the wind still moved the trees the same way, if the deer still came in the evenings. Fun. Nigh what you miss when you can't touch it anymore. The nurses watched me closely. I had the look of time on me, slow steps, a tremor in the hand, breath that came and went with its own pace. They knew I was sick, the kind of sick that doesn't argue, just waits. But I didn't fear dying. I feared forgetting. And more than that, I feared being remembered wrong. So I kept quiet. Let the myth build without my help. Let the stories twist. Let the papers write their versions and the agents pat themselves on the back. Because I knew the truth sat quietly inside me, like a stone beneath a river, worn, but never moved. And in that silence, I remained free. Even behind the bars. By the time the leaves turned gold again, I had lost track of how many autumns I'd missed. Seasons pass differently when there's no street to walk, no city to breathe in, no wind carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts from a corner cart. In here, the air stays the same, filtered, stale, still. But my memory, My memory stayed alive. At night, when the lights dimmed and the corridor hushed to a hum, I'd lie on the stiff cot and revisit old streets. Mott Street in the rain, 116th in the snow, Harlem summers sticky with noise and smoke, the rhythm of footsteps echoing off alley walls, the knock of a soldier's hand on a back door at midnight, all of it clear, sharper than any calendar or clock. Sometimes I'd hear voices, not hallucinations, just echoes of men I once knew. Charlie with his dry wit, Benny with his constant pacing, Chin, always just a little slower, a little quieter, saying more with a tilt of the head than most could with a speech. There was no regret in those memories, no weight of guilt pressing down, only acknowledgement, like flipping through a photo album and nodding at each page. That was him, that was her, that was what happened. The guards called me sir, even the young ones. They'd walk slower past my cell, as if the years I carried held gravity. Some knew the name, most didn't, but they felt something. Authority doesn't need a title. It hangs in the silence, in the way you sit, the way you listen without reacting. In the yard, I moved slow, sat on the same bench, let the sun warm what it could. A few inmates would pass by and offer a nod or small talk. I responded, but rarely led. I had said all I needed to in life. I'd built my world on restraint, not noise. A boss doesn't bark, he waits. A priest came once a week, young, nervous, kept offering prayers, thinking I needed forgiveness. But I didn't, not because I thought I was a saint, far from it, but because I had never pretended to be anything else. I lived by my rules, never broke my word, never turned on my own, and I never asked for what wasn't mine. If that wasn't enough for heaven, so be it. What I wanted, what I hoped for, was that when I left, the world would remember the silence, not the shouting, the calm hand, not the clenched fist, that they'd say I was steady, loyal, measured. Because in a world of noise, being quiet is the rarest kind of power, and in that quiet I could still feel the streets beneath my feet, even if they were only memories now. It was early spring when they brought him in. Grey coat, neat tie, hands folded like he was still in church. He looked around the visitor's room with the kind of quiet dignity I remembered from another life. And then he smiled, slowly, respectfully, as if he wasn't sure if I'd remember. But I did. It was Michael. His father and I had come up together, small-time numbers in East Harlem before the war. His old man never made headlines, but he was solid, loyal. He never asked for more than he earned, never pushed for a bigger slice. He worked, collected, kicked up, and kept his mouth shut. When he passed, I sent flowers, but I stayed away from the funeral. By then, the spotlight on me was too bright. Michael sat across from me, nervous, like a schoolboy meeting a headmaster. But I could see the weight behind his eyes. He wasn't a civilian anymore. He'd stepped into something, maybe not the life, but something close. Maybe law, maybe politics, maybe both. We spoke slowly. No rush, no fear. He asked questions that danced carefully around certain subjects, not direct, not accusatory, just curious, like he was trying to understand something passed down in blood but never spoken aloud at the dinner table. He asked me what I thought about power. I said power doesn't shout. It waits, watches, knows the end of the story before the first page turns. He asked if I believed in redemption. I said redemption is just remembering your story without flinching. He asked if I missed freedom. I told him I never lost it, because I never gave them my silence. He smiled again, a little more steady this time. Said he wanted to write something someday, not about me, about legacy, about men who lived in the grey space between law and loyalty. I told him to be careful, that the line between myth and truth is thinner than most think. And once you start polishing the past, it stops being honest. He nodded, took a breath. Then he asked the last question, the one that lingered long after he'd left. Do you regret any of it? I looked at him, this young man holding generations in his shoulders, and said only this: you don't regret a road you chose with both eyes open, you just walk it all the way. He left with a handshake, firm, grateful, and I watched him go, wondering if that would be the last time a piece of my old world came walking back into view. That night, I sat on the edge of my cot and stared out through the narrow window. The trees beyond the wire were blooming again. Time moves forward, even when you're standing still. Names carry weight, not just in the street, but in the soul. A name whispered in respect lingers longer than any headline. A name betrayed echoes louder than any bullet. I'd spent a lifetime holding names like marbles in my hand, turning them, knowing their weight, knowing when to carry them and when to let them go. In prison, the names never stopped arriving, some old, some new, some spoken in low tones, others scrawled in newspaper clippings that made their way into my cell once a week. But there was one name that kept returning in the letters I never asked for. Vinny. Vincent the Chin Gigante. He was still out there, playing crazy, walking the village in that bathrobe, and it worked, for a time. They laughed at him, mocked the act, but I knew better. Vinny wasn't acting, not entirely. He leaned into madness because the world expected it, and in doing so, he bought himself years where he could still whisper, still decide, still lead from the shadows. They said I was the boss, but it was always Vinny pulling the strings. That was the plan. I was the front, the shield, the old man with the hat who'd take the heat. I agreed to it, willingly. Not out of fear, out of strategy, out of loyalty. We kept the name Genovese out of the papers that way. Let the feds chase ghosts while the real moves happened in the quiet. Sometimes I wondered if Vinny ever thought about me, whether he sat in some safe apartment behind layers of buffers and remembered the men who took the weight for him, men like me. But I never held resentment, because the life didn't promise fairness. It promised loyalty, and I gave it. Names like Castellano, Gotti, Persico, they made the front page. Their drama was loud, their downfalls louder, but the Genovese name stayed clean in comparison. We were the architects behind the curtain, and that curtain stayed drawn because of sacrifices, becai. How some of us chose to fade, so others could move. I'd see new names in the papers sometimes, younger guys, flashy, loud, wearing watches that cost more than a house. I'd shake my head, not in anger, in sadness. They didn't understand the old code. Respect over riches, silence over spotlight. Those men wouldn't last. The ones who did were ghosts, unseen, untouched. And in my cell, I became one of them. A name with weight, a name spoken quietly. Not because they feared me, but because they knew I never broke. And in this life, that's all that matters. The days in Otisville grew slower, not shorter. Time doesn't rush in places like that. It sits beside you, like an old friend who's got nothing better to do. The routine became muscle memory, mornings with the same cup, afternoons with the same bench, evenings with the same sound of the metal door sliding shut. But behind all that quiet, there was still business, not the kind with guns or envelopes. That part was long gone. What I'm talking about is legacy, influence, the passing of the torch without ever touching it, because even from behind a wall, words still moved, calls were made, messages sent through visitors, through whispers carried by old hands that still remembered who I was. They'd come from time to time, lawyers mostly, sometimes a cousin of a cousin. They came to check in, but I knew the real purpose. They were sounding boards, checking to see if the old man still had thoughts, if his instincts still sharpened the edge. I gave them just enough. A phrase, a name, a story from 50 years back that somehow still mattered today. One kid, early 30s, tried to push too hard, came in slick, talked fast, wanted to know about old money. Where it went. I looked at him and said, money's like water. It flows where the pressure's lowest. He didn't get it. He left frustrated. I never saw him again. That was fine. He wasn't built for the life. You could tell by the way his shoes clicked too loud on the floor. You see, the real earners didn't need noise. They understood weight, timing, stillness. I thought often about the Bronx in those years. The corner spots, the bakeries we used for sit-downs, the upstairs rooms that smelled of espresso and sweat. Deals made over cigars, not contracts. Back then, honor didn't have to be explained. It was worn like a second skin. Now the world had changed. They had rules written down, paper trails, deals made through screens. And still, they thought they were safer, smarter. But what they didn't know was that the safest place a secret ever lived was in a man's silence. That's why I kept mine. No memoirs, no interviews, no TV specials with the old man spilling everything for a check. I left the stories inside, let the silence grow thicker around them, because once you let the world decide your story, you're no longer the author. And I never gave up that pen. Even now, sitting in a cell, far from the old neighborhoods, I held that power, not in the way most understood it, but in the way that lasts. Quiet, unshaken, complete. Every so often, someone would slide a folded newspaper through the bars or leave it tucked into my tray with lunch. I never asked for them, but they knew. The guards, the other inmates, some part of them wanted me to stay connected, or maybe they just wanted to see my reaction. Most days I didn't bother reading past the first page, but now and then a headline caught my eye. Another arrest, another flip, another name I hadn't heard in decades suddenly resurfacing, tangled in a new indictment. Sometimes I'd recognize the faces, men who used to sit at the tables, now wearing wires or giving testimony with that glassy look in their eyes. And in those photos, I saw the same thing every time, a hunger that had turned into fear, a greed that had turned into loneliness. One name stuck out, Frankie Romano. He'd been just a kid when I first met him, skinny, always running errands with wide eyes and fast feet. His uncle vouched for him, said he was solid. He was, for a while. But ambition got the better of him. He wanted to rise fast, too fast. The papers said he turned, wore a wire, brought down 4 guys in Jersey and 1 in Queens, claimed he feared for his life, claimed the family turned cold on him. But I remembered Frankie differently. He was never made, never sworn in, just a fringe runner with big dreams and a louder mouth. That's the problem with the newer generation. They think proximity is power. They think if they sit close enough to the boss, it makes them untouchable. But power isn't borrowed. It's earned, slowly, with silence, with sacrifice. And when you skip the steps, the fall is quicker and louder. One afternoon, an older guard, Irish kid, polite, asked if it bothered me. Watching the world out there change, watching the names fall like dominoes, watching the structure collapse piece by piece, I told him no, because we were never built to last forever. The life was like a cathedral built on sand. It stood for a long time, long enough to become legend, but eventually everything sinks. The smart ones accept that. They don't try to hold up the walls, they just make sure they're remembered when the dust settles. I didn't care about statues or streets named after me. I only cared that when someone whispered Fat Tony, they said it with a kind of reverence, not fear, not pity, just respect. That's what lasts longest in the end, not the money, not the power, just the way your name lingers when you're gone. There's a sound prisons make that you don't hear in the movies. It's not the clank of bars or the slam of steel doors. It's softer than that. It's the shuffle of tired feet against concrete, the quiet coughs behind walls, the low hum of voices that never rise above a whisper. It's the sound of time folding over itself, of men waiting, always waiting. In those corridors, I became part of the rhythm, not feared, not followed, just recognized. A nod from the guards, a respectful glance from the young ones. They knew the name, maybe not the details, but they knew enough to tread softly when I passed. I didn't talk much. I'd answer if asked, give advice when it was truly needed, but I didn't hold court like some of the other old-timers. This wasn't a reunion. It wasn't the old neighborhood. This was where we ended up when the story turned cold. Still, some came to me, not with questions of money or muscle, but for memory. They wanted to know how it used to be, what it meant to have a name that echoed through Harlem, the Bronx, Midtown. I'd share little pieces here and there, a story about a sit-down gone right, a warning from a boss long dead, but always measured, always with the understanding that some things don't belong in the air anymore. There was one kid, maybe 25, who asked if I ever missed the streets. I told him no. I missed the way respect used to feel, the way men stood when you entered a room, the way loyalty wasn't questioned every other day. But the streets, no, they never loved us. They just gave us a place to spend our lives. He nodded like he understood, but he didn't, not yet. He still thought respect came from being seen, from being known, but real respect, the kind that lingers long after you're gone, that's born in the quiet, in the things you choose not to say, in the orders you give with a look, not a shout. The corridors of this piece of art. Lace held those echoes, men long gone, their shadows still lingering in the corners. Some fell to time, others to betrayal. A few, like me, just faded into the walls. And still, the rhythm continued. The slow pace of a life winding down. No alarms, no explosions, just the silence of a chapter ending the way it should. Without spectacle, without drama, just peace. It wasn't planned, not formally, but it had the feeling of a sit-down, one of those rare moments when time slows and something old makes its way back into the present. The chapel was empty that afternoon, sunlight casting soft lines through the high windows, dust hanging like old secrets in the air. He was brought in quietly, an older man, stooped but not weak, walking like someone who still remembered what it meant to move with purpose. I hadn't seen Carmine in over 30 years. Back then, he ran numbers for us in the Upper East, quiet earner. Never chased titles, never wanted to be seen, which made him valuable. We didn't speak for the first few minutes, just sat in the pews, the room holding a silence that felt sacred, not religious, just real. Then he said, "They're all gone." I nodded, because I already knew, the bosses, the captains, the lieutenants, all either buried, flipped, or forgotten. The streets had new kings now, young, loud, reckless, men who built reputations on headlines instead of deeds. Carmine leaned forward, hands clasped like prayer. They don't even know the names anymore. That's what hit hardest. Not the years lost, not the friends buried, but the erasure, the way time strips away meaning if no one's left to speak it. We talked for a while, slow, measured, about old cases, about the war in the 80s, about the quiet ones who never made the papers but shaped the whole foundation. He asked about Vinny. I told him what little I knew, that the chin kept the game going longer than any of us thought possible. That madness was just another suit he wore better than most. Carmine laughed then, a low, tired sound. We were ghosts even when we were alive, he said. And he was right. We moved through the world like shadows, not because we were hiding, but because the life demanded it. Visibility was danger, fame was a curse, and now, in this quiet room, two old men remembered things no one else would ever know. Before he left, he turned to me. "They're going to talk about you, Tony. Maybe not now, maybe not tomorrow, but someday. Some kid in a barber shop, some guy reading a book, your name's going to come up, and when it does, they'll say it with weight." I didn't respond, just nodded, because I didn't need the talk. I didn't need the story to survive me. I just needed to know it was told right, that the truth sat somewhere quiet, waiting for the right voice to find it. There comes a moment in every man's life when time stops being the enemy. At first, it's the thing you're running from, chasing deals, dodging heat, trying to hold on to youth like a prize that slips through your fingers. But later, if you make it far enough, it becomes a kind of companion, not forgiving, but honest. I stopped counting days in Otisville. There wasn't any point. Time moved slower there, like syrup poured from a cold bottle. And somehow, that was fine. I wasn't in a rush anymore. Not to prove anything. Not to fix anything. I had made peace with the walls, with the routine, with the silence. I'd wake up early. Same cot, same ceiling, same hum of the vent overhead. Some mornings I'd just lie there, eyes open, letting the minutes drift, remembering. I remembered the sound of dice hitting a basement floor in Harlem. I remembered the clink of espresso cups on white porcelain in Arthur Avenue cafes. I remembered the faces, laughing, scowling, sweating under wool coats in summer heat. And I remembered the weight of decisions made in whispers, behind closed doors, while the rest of the world slept. Time gave me those memories like a gift I hadn't earned, but still received. Sometimes I'd sit in the library. It was small, a few shelves, mostly old paperbacks and donated hardcovers. I liked the smell of the books. Reminded me of old ledgers, back when everything was written by hand. I'd read a page, then stop, let the words hang in the air. Not because they were new to me, but because they felt familiar in ways I couldn't explain. Other inmates asked me if I had regrets. Of course I did, but not the kind they thought. I didn't regret the life. I didn't regret the loyalty. I didn't even regret the years behind bars. What I regretted was that we hadn't passed it down better, that the code we lived by, respect, silence, honor, got lost in translation, that the Ness who came after us thought it was about flash and firepower. They didn't understand what it meant to sit at a table and have your word mean something, to shake hands and know that was the end of it. Time, in the end, had stripped everything down to what mattered. The quiet, the dignity, the rhythm of breath and memory, and in that rhythm I found peace. Not redemption, not glory, just peace. The seasons changed, though you wouldn't always notice it inside, but I felt it in the air. Cooler mornings, the way light shifted across the yard, the smell of leaves distant beyond the fence. Autumn was always my favorite. Back home in East Harlem, it meant overcoats and cigars, long walks with collar upturned, steam rising from sewer grates like whispers from the city's lungs. In here, it meant softer sun, quieter afternoons, and a strange stillness at dusk. I'd sit in the courtyard when allowed, a concrete bench beneath a tired tree that hadn't bloomed in years. I'd watch the sky dim, cloud edges painted gold and pink, and listen to the breeze push through the wire mesh above us. It almost sounded like waves. One evening I felt it, that small tug at the edge of my mind, not fear, not sorrow, just a soft knowing. Like a hand on your shoulder, familiar and warm. I wasn't sick, not in the medical way, but I could tell something inside had begun to slow, not decay, just settle. Like dust finally landing after years of movement. I'd lived longer than most in my world, outlasted friends, enemies, and the system itself, and now, as the days shortened, I felt the quiet come closer. There were no goodbyes in this place, just nods, a few words in passing. But one of the younger guards, one who always treated me with a quiet kind of respect, paused before locking the yard gate. "You're a legend, Mr. Salerno." I gave a half smile. "Legends don't sit on cold benches, kid." He shook his head. "The real ones do." He meant it, and that meant something. I didn't need statues, didn't need documentaries or books with my picture on the cover. I just needed that moment, that respect, that truth spoken without fanfare. When I returned to my cell, I lay on the cot, hands folded on my chest, breathing slow. I thought about my father, hands stained from the market. Thought about the street corners, the dark suits, the rooms filled with quiet power. I thought about the oath I took, the lives I touched, the ones I lost. And I thought about how all of it, every bit of it, had led to this moment. Still, soft, whole. The morning came like all the others. Pale sun filtering through the narrow window, quiet footsteps in the corridor, the distant rattle of breakfast trays. But there was something different about this morning, a stillness deeper than the usual silence, like the building itself was holding its breath. I sat up slowly. My bones ached in the familiar way. My breath came steady, but shorter. The air felt thinner, touched with something colder. I took my time dressing, pulled on the same beige shirt, the same worn trousers, brushed back what little hair I had left, looked at my reflection in the scratched metal mirror, deep lines, tired eyes, but dignity still there, always dignity. I didn't speak much that day, didn't need to. I nodded to the old-timer near the laundry, shook hands with a kitchen clerk I'd helped keep out of trouble years ago, the same routine, the same path, but slower, measured, like walking through a dream that knew its end. In the afternoon I returned to the chapel. It was empty again, always empty, just rows of wooden pews and a crucifix that hung a little crooked above the altar. I sat in the third row, the same spot I had always favored. The light through the windows painted soft gold lines across the floor. I closed my eyes. And in that darkness, I saw everything. The streets of Harlem in the 30s, steam rising from manholes, the roll of dice echoing in basements, the smoke-filled back rooms where decisions shaped the city, Tommy guns wrapped in butcher paper, the quiet clink of glasses in restaurants no longer standing, the low voices of men with names etched into history, most now dust. I saw my mother's hands, small and worn from work. I saw my father, standing behind a counter, pride in his posture even when the world gave him little. I saw the faces of those I led, those I protected, those I buried. Then I heard the door open, a gut, odd, young, respectful. He didn't speak, just stood there a moment, then stepped aside as a second man entered, older, in a suit too fine for prison, an agent, perhaps, or a lawyer, or just someone who wanted to see the man behind the name. "Anthony Salerno?" he asked. I looked up, met his gaze, didn't answer right away. Then I nodded. He said nothing more, just gave a small, courteous nod, and left. That was the last word ever spoken to me in this world. I didn't move from that bench, just sat there, hands folded, breath slowing like a tide returning to sea. And as the light dimmed and the quiet grew complete, I let go. Not in fear, not in sorrow, but in peace. Because the life I had lived, the choices I made, the rules I honored, they were mine. All mine. And now, so was the silence.